So, what happens if you dive into the private letters of Hitler's most powerful Panzer generals? Well, that's what David Stahel did, and he wrote a book and it completely rewrites our whole idea of the war machine on the Eastern Front. In this episode, we explore the minds behind Blitzkrieg, the psychology of General Guderian, and the hidden cost of the Nazi military ambition. Watch this episode if you want to go beyond the battles. We're going to talk about manipulation, the psychology of power, the tactics, propaganda, and of course, the decline. Okay, so before we start the interview, if you're watching this, you're probably into history. Well, lucky for you, I made a list of 100 history books that will change your life. It's completely free, link is in the description, and enjoy the episode now.
Believe it or not, they actually used a different alphabet. So there was not a, crazy, right? Sorry, when I say a
What?
different alphabet, sorry, I should have rephrased that. It's the same alphabet, but they formed the letters differently. So it depends on where in Germany you're raised as to what the script or the standard of the script would be. And it really comes to, we know Germany becomes Germany in sort of 1871, but that doesn't mean that just because they've amalgamated all these states, and that process has been in progress since the Middle Ages, really, where, multiple, it used to be a whole big confederation of different types of principalities and duchies and all these different things. And as those slowly amalgamated, it didn't mean that those education reforms had taken place. So just about wherever you were had their own standards for forming letters. And there's a few attempts in the early stages of a unified Germany where they come up with something called the Zitterlin reforms. I won't go into it, but it's basically an attempt to have, one standard through all of Prussia at least. And then they're going to, in subsequent decades, roll this out. It just means, though, German generals, when they're young boys in the late part of the 19th century, these reforms haven't yet happened. So how they write is unique to wherever they're raised. And for example, in the letters that I had, Guderians are extremely hard to read. Herpener is not so bad. Herpener is problematic. Schmidt is not so bad, and then Reinhardt typed his. So one of the problems I had was I couldn't read them, but I even showed them to a good friend of mine, a German. I wasn't raised with German, and he sat there and said, I can make out the occasional word, but I can't read them. So I had two different people basically transcribe them into German, so that I could read them, and that sort of started the whole thing going.
And how long ago was this?
Sorry, you're absolutely right. That's a good question. Originally, I never looked at them for my first couple of books, and then in about 2015, I suddenly thought to myself, they might be really interesting as sources. And the reason I dismissed them earlier was, yes, because I couldn't read them, but I also had this thought, well, there's something in the German army called the Ordnance on Communication. So basically, it stipulates what you, as a soldier, are allowed to put in your letters home. And they're very, very strict. You are not allowed to mention any town that you're in. You're not allowed to mention the name of your officer, even if it's just a lieutenant, right? You're not allowed to name anybody. You're not allowed to share any propaganda that you might have heard. You're not allowed to. There's a big long list, right? Now, that's strictly enforced. There's also a censor, so people are reading letters at the divisional level. So when you send them, you don't know if your letter is going to get read or not. And my thinking at the very beginning was, okay, so it's very strict. And if you're a German general, the things that I'm interested in are all the details, right? I want to know all the details. They won't be allowed to share any of this. Not at all. This German average soldiers can't share basic things. So what would be the chance if I got the money and I bothered to, and as a graduate student, I didn't have that much money, if I'd finally gotten these things transcribed, and what's going to be in them? Oh, my darling, I hope that you're having a wonderful holiday on the island of Rügen, and I hope your mother's varicose veins are doing better, or goodness knows what, right? But all this stuff that I don't need, and I've just spent all this money to get it. So I didn't look at it. And I went on and I wrote my operational histories, and if I could have read them, I would have, but I couldn't, and it was going to be expensive. 20 years later in my career, I basically sat there and I thought, I've now got the research funds to go back and have these things transcribed. And I was suddenly a lot more curious what exactly is in these letters. is it the case that they ignore all the military stuff? Because I had seen bits and pieces in other people's things. There's not a lot of stuff out there with them in them, with that sort of stuff in there. But Johannes Herter is one historian. He has a wonderful book that uses them. And there were sentences. He didn't use a lot because he doesn't spend a lot of time on military things. But there were sentences that he was putting in his book that, I mean, my goodness, these were explicitly military content. And I suddenly thought, goodness gracious, what if there's lots of that? So I spent the money. I'll never forget it. I sort of opened this email on my laptop. It was at work, and I quickly read it, and then I thought, oh my God, this is a goldmine. And so I took some time that night, and I sat down, and I just thought, it's funny because my first thought was, oh no, this is terrible. I've gone and written all these, what I thought were authoritative histories, having tried to triangulate it with divisional files and corps files and army group files and Panzer group files. I've done it all. I've done all the research. And now I've missed their own letters. Those books were written without the letters. And I thought, no, I never knew that it was in there. But I then thought about it a bit more and I actually thought, no, this is actually a better thing for two reasons. One, a lot of that information that's in there, a lot of what was so interesting and so exciting was a lot to do with, it's kind of what you were saying before. It's much more about the man. And I suddenly thought, gosh, this is so rich. And I started ordering all the other letter collections thinking, what are the chances they're all like Guderian? They're all discussing this stuff. Turns out that's what it was. And that's why I decided with Reinhardt, Schmidt, Herpener, and Guderian. If your audience don't know who they are, in a very simple way, these are all leading Panzer Group commanders from 1941. So that's immediately interesting because they are all on a very similar level. I mean, German generals, I know people think of a general as just a general, but actually there's many different ranks, there's different positions. Trying to compare these guys, it's a little bit like comparing apples and oranges, right? Because they're not all serving in the same place at the same time, where all these guys were at the same level, on the same front, and at the same time. In fact, by the end of 41, they're all inside the same army group.
Could you, for the people who have no idea, like, what was their common goal for those four generals in the war?
So they are high level, but they are not by any means the highest level. So if you imagine Hitler, he has his sort of circle of generals around him. That's the OKW. Then there's the OKW is the High Command of the Wehrmacht. So that's all the armed forces, right? So then if you go to the army, then there's the High Command of the Army, and there's another group of generals, the OKH. Now, none of these guys end up being like battlefield commanders. They're not directly in command of troops, so they're sort of removed from the fighting. And then when you do get to, I guess, the front, you have to remember the Eastern Front is on a scale so much larger than really any other war that's been fought that you end up with command levels that really don't exist in any other war other than this war. So the first level would be these army group commanders. So imagine there are so many armies, they start putting them into groups: Army Group North, Army Group Center, Army Group South. They have individual commanders. But there isn't one guy who sits there and says, I am the commander of the Eastern Front. Hitler doesn't really go down that path. I think he likes the divided loyalties and divided sort of commands as well. Nominally, the OKH, the High Command of the Army, is running the Eastern Front, but Hitler's constantly interfering. So there's army group commanders, and then there's armies. To give you an idea, there are these 3 army groups, then there are 13 armies, and then below the armies, attached to them, are these panzer groups. So I know that's kind of convoluted, but very quickly, that's just where these guys sit. And to give you an idea, there's only 4 panzer groups on the whole Eastern Front. So it's not like there's 13 armies. It makes it sound like, oh, there must be lots of these. But actually, there aren't so many, which means they're incredibly important. The German army doesn't move forward because, yeah, don't you know, it's got 3 million men. That's not what moves it forward. It moves forward because of these 4 panzer groups. Maybe just quickly on that, just to give people a really good sense of it, there are 150 divisions on the Eastern Front when the Germans invade for Operation Barbarossa. 120 of those are infantry divisions, or a few mountain divisions, security divisions, and so on. But these are, imagine, soldiers literally marching into the country, horse-drawn artillery, wagons. That's how fast they move. This is not Blitzkrieg as people think of it. That side to it is only 30 divisions of the 150. They are motorized and Panzer divisions, and they are concentrated inside these Panzer groups. So the German army kind of moves at two different speeds. There's the very fast, mobile, but small part of it, and then there is this big, laborious, slow-moving, horse-drawn, 600,000 horses, overwhelming majority of the men who are marching quite literally like Napoleon's army marching into the east. And that just means that what these panzer groups are able to achieve is disproportionate to their numbers in terms of their importance to the war.
Mm. And is this a tactic that's always being used, like always having one group that's a little slower, but like quite big? I mean, like 120 from the 150 is quite a lot, and then 30,000 who are like really moving with speed.
Yeah, so I mean, yes and no. If you go back before the period, I mean, the Second World War is really the first war where there's large scale use of tanks. I know some people listening might want to point out they had them in the First World War. Yes, they did, but they're very slow. They're not really independent. A lot of those ideas come through German innovations in the interwar period, and then we see them in the Second World War. But if you went back before that, I mean, you could always look at the cavalry, which was the natural sort of predecessor of the tank, and they were obviously very mobile on the battlefield. And for various periods, if you go back to the Middle Ages, they were your consummate professionals. The knights were the ones who had training. Pretty much everyone else on the battlefield was just there to pick up your pitchfork and go to war. Some people had more experience than that, archers and so on. But it depends from army to army. As a rule, though, yeah, this is I think it's part of the reason why the Germans have as much success in the early stages of the Second World War, because they have really rethought a lot of that. You could say the French have tanks in 1940, they do, but that their concept of how to use them, the doctrine and the training and the autonomy of those tanks and that command culture is very, very different. And it's a huge force multiplier for the Germans.
And what role did Guderian play in that, like tactical wise? Because that's the person we're gonna like be most focused on in this conversation. Like, what role did he play in that?
That's a good question. So, in a short answer on that, if you read his memoir, and for a lot of people, certainly in the sort of first 30 years after the war, they did read his memoir because there wasn't a lot of other good studies to sort of balance out who was the father of this new Panzer idea and so on. And Guderian very much set himself up as there. That was me. I'm an innovator. And he's definitely in the command. How much he has is hotly debated, but he has a lot less. It's very safe to say, is a lot less to do with that innovation than some of his commanding officers and some of his contemporaries as well. But he's in there. He has a voice, of course. He just believes it's a much bigger role and sells it that way after the war. And some other people wrote that for a long time as well. Little Hart and other such people, they really prop him up. Um, but yeah, I mean, um, I guess, contribution is more as a commander than an innovator. Um, Although I would be quite critical of him as a commander as well. For a long time, not to sort of go into a different area, but for a very long time after the war, people saw him and a lot of the other panzer generals as being a kind of an elite within the German army. And that idea comes not just from the way in which they're using tanks and conceiving of mobile warfare, but because it's so bold and brash. And they're not wrong. Those ideas are part of the success of the Panzertrooper. So why do they win in France in 1940? It's, Guderian's extremely bold, very daring. He does, without going through the whole campaign, but he makes decisions that reflect that culture, and he's very successful in it. There's no question. What's very interesting, though, is if you then contrast that same mentality and that same idea with a war in the East, which is, of course, the next year, the next war, the next campaign he's going to fight. And again, Guderian, we can talk about Guderian specifically, but he's he's not a for a long time, people used to think, oh, he stood aside. He was the the quintessential Panzer commander. One of the interesting things about doing a book where I looked at 4 of them is that thing we saw replicated among the others as well. In other words, he's very much a part of a sort of a common culture rather than someone who is completely standing alone and separate from everyone else. In other words, there's an incredibly aggressive culture there. But while that's very successful in France, that's unsuccessful in the East. Because in a sense, you could always argue in the French campaign, once you make it to the English Channel, there's really, that's the end of a campaign. You've bottled up your enemy and there's nothing else they can do, which is exactly what happens, right? That the French and the British are bottled up and, hence the whole Dunkirk thing. But in the East, there's no end to it, right? And the Soviet Union is an expanding funnel. The further you go to the east, the wider the front gets. So the ability to sort of pin your enemy on anything and win, well, there's just kind of endless space. And there's not really a recognition for the Panzer generals that they are sort of punching into nothing all the time. They keep winning battlefield victories, and they assume that if they keep doing this, that will just equal strategic success. So we just keep driving. And the problem is, every time you do it, this is the kind of Clausewitz idea of sort of military strategy is the attacker will always get weaker the further they keep advancing. And the person who's on the defensive, so long as they have strategic depth, will always get stronger because they fall back on their centers of supply, they fall back on their own population centers, whereas the other one becomes overextended, extends further out. That was a concept as basic as that perhaps sounds. It's a concept that Guderian and many other Panzer generals really never grasped. In fact, I'd probably say the whole German army struggles with that idea. But the Panzer generals in particular. So they keep driving and driving and driving to the point where they will literally have, I read files where they'd say, well, we've only got 3 trucks left and 1 towed piece of artillery. And the order would come down, we'll drive it forward. Go, take the bridge. And, of course, that's going to be very, very difficult if you are unsupported with logistics, haven't got enough firepower, haven't got enough fuel, haven't got enough ammunition, and then you drive on a defensive site. You're just going to have casualties. And this happens time and again. The attrition rates of officers in Panzer divisions or motorized divisions are extremely high. And there's a very, very slow, I'd even say almost no recognition. There's just no learning curve on this. Yeah.
And do you see when you were studying the letters, do you see in the generals that they're truly don't grasp it, or do you see here and there it's in bits that they are starting to understand that they're basically hitting into nothing?
I think you're absolutely right to ask that. That's a good question. I'd phrase that a different way. Yes, we can chart it through the letters. That's definitely true. But if I think about my process of trying to explore this Barbarossa campaign, keep in mind the Barbarossa campaign is thought of being a 6 to 10 week campaign. So you're absolutely right. Drive hard, drive fast, knock the enemy, sort of encircle them, break through the front, and then keep him off balance by keep driving into his rear, right? That's kind of 101 military thinking, and that makes a lot of sense, and that has had success in smaller campaign areas. So there's nothing wrong with that, right? But what do we do when we get to the end of 6 weeks? The Panzer generals have been driving forward. They have seized, by that stage, up to sort of 300 kilometers of ground. They've had a lot of success, but they are, as a consequence of their own success, they have 2 problems. They now have extremely long logistics. And it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter how much firepower your tank has. It doesn't have anything if it doesn't have fuel, right? And it doesn't have anything if it doesn't have any infantry support. And what did we say before? The infantry's, for the most part, marching. Yes, there's motorized infantry as well, but that's not the real backbone of the German army. Keep in mind, the Soviet army is also millions of men, right? And the time in which it takes them to traverse these distances is extremely short. So, for example, in that first 300 kilometers, the Germans will reach, let's say, Smolensk. I'm sorry, Minsk in the first basically week to 10 days of the campaign, right? That's a very long distance in only such a short period. And that results in a very big battle there. It's called the Battle of Minsk. It's actually the Battle of Belarus. So we say Minsk, and that makes most people think, oh, so it was a battle in a city, was it? Well, not really. They just give that city's name to the bigger battle. It probably makes more sense to call it the Battle of Belarus because that's the scale on which this is happening. And then they keep driving forward, and they, in the next basic week, 2 weeks, get to a place like Smolensk. That's another 300 kilometers in. So we are literally 1 month into this campaign when they're taking Smolensk. They are now 600 kilometers into the Soviet Union. So to come back to your question, does it make sense to do that? Well, in those early weeks, sure, I guess. They're winning big battles. They're driving into the Soviet Union. That's what you're supposed to do. 4 weeks on from that, so the middle of August, they really haven't advanced much at all. And people sometimes say, oh, why don't they advance? Well, they should have keep driving, right? But they can't. They can't for two reasons. One, as I said before, they really don't have any fuel. Number two, you can drive on, but as you drive on, you're going to immediately have to expend a lot of ammunition. You're going to need to have your motorized infantry up there. And if you've just driven 600 kilometers over really poor Soviet roads, and keep in mind, these things aren't sealed. They're heavily loaded, the vehicles, because they're carrying fuel, they're carrying ammunition, they're carrying men. And these are all vehicles that are designed in the 1920s and 30s. So they don't exactly survive this process very well. So there's huge attrition rates among the tanks and among the vehicles. And now they are at this distance, 600 kilometers into the Soviet Union, and they need a lot of spare parts. They need to do a lot of repair. They need to bring up fuel. They need to bring up ammunition in order to launch the next phase. And the next phase, once you're 600 kilometers in, you're about 300 kilometers from Moscow, right? And they want to try and seize Moscow. So they're going to gather these supplies. If you just indulge me one more minute, there's one more big problem. In the period it takes you to traverse that 600 kilometers, you certainly cannot destroy completely Soviet armies, capture every village, every town, comb through them, round up everybody, and bring them back to your prisoner of war camps. What they're actually doing is just advancing on the roads. And what's on the left and right of those roads is not very interesting to them because they can't stop. They're just driving, driving, driving.
But that must mean you've got like a lot of danger in your camp, right? Like behind you, you've left like a couple enemies.
100%. You know how wide the Soviet Union is, right? The people who are supposed to clear that out are the infantry coming behind. But they can't really do it either because they're going to have to advance on roads as well. And the road network is very poor. They've still got to move all these horses, all these wagons, all the field kitchens. They've got to bring all their tents, everything that 3 million men need. So they're not combing through the forests. So you can capture Minsk after 10 days, but you can't clear Belarus in 10 days. And you're absolutely right. There were 3 Soviet armies in Belarus. So where are they? They're running around in the forests and in the swamps, depending on which part you're in, sometimes not even aware that they're behind enemy lines. But when they go down to the roads, they start to realize, my God, there's a lot of vehicles traveling here. We're in trouble. Now, that doesn't it means different things. Some of them are captured, no question. Some of them are killed because they try to fight. And some of them become the beginning of the partisan movements, right? But the other point is between where the panzers have advanced and where that marching infantry are slowly making up the distance because they just can't march that fast. I mean, how long would it take either of us? Probably you'd be a better example, but how long would it take you to march 600 kilometers or to walk 600 kilometers? It takes weeks, right? So they're really pushing the infantry super hard. But that means they're also not able to comb through the areas. And in that space between where the front is, where the Panzer divisions are and the motorized divisions, that gap, which is sometimes hundreds of kilometers, you're absolutely right. It's being traversed by thin-skinned vehicles that are very, very slow in their movement because the roads are bumpy and they're trying to traverse them, they're very, very good targets. Part of the reason why the Germans lose so many vehicles in Barbarossa is, yes, the vehicles are old and they're moving on these bumpy roads, but also because they're sitting ducks. You just set up a machine gun and you can just shoot. The people will die and then they can't really defend them very well. And then good luck trying to find who shot those bullets from somewhere in the forest, right? And the Soviets become suddenly, this is a window of opportunity in a sense that closes because the infantry are marching up. But even once they do, these rear areas are huge. Um, so yeah, it's a big problem operationally for how Barbarossa is moving. Maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I brought so many questions. Like, the first thing I was thinking, like, communication style. Like, how do you even communicate something like such a large army? Especially like if one is moving with speed, the other one is moving slower. So you got two different speeds. You have to like, yeah, like, how does that even work?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's interesting about the communications is Germans at that time probably would have said, actually, we are remarkably well connected. And that's not because they were connected really well, certainly not by our standards, but by the standards of the time, radio had made it much easier to communicate and to try and apply some sort of coordination to all of this. And relative to what you would have seen certainly decades before, for really big armies, wow, this was remarkably well coordinated, again, especially given the size. But that's not to say that your point isn't absolutely right. The Soviet Union is vast. One of the problems that they have is they actually don't have very good maps at all. They've got maps that are printed in some cases in the 19th century, so they don't have all the right roads on them, or the road, it says on it that it's a main road, and what they're seeing is just a dirt track. And so they've sort of planned on certain basis of like, we're going to be able to move at a certain speed or have an ability to coordinate, and that's just not what they're encountering. Huge numbers of units also get lost, so that is also typical. And it, and there's often a lot of problems in coordinating with other units. So you keep in mind each army group runs its own part of the war. But there is two things. There's poor communication between them, especially at these areas where there's gaps between them, right? That can be everyone is being sucked into this expanding funnel. So the number of forces you have is being stretched. It's being stretched in two ways: lengthwise, so east to west, because some forces are obviously marching at different speeds on different roads. Some are prioritized, some aren't. So that's a problem. But they're also being stretched out left to right, or east to north to south in this case. And so what there is there's often rivalry between the army groups, or sometimes between the armies themselves, to say, you have to cover more because I want concentration. Militaries are built on punching power, and the more you can concentrate, the more you can punch. The more you have to spread out, the less punch you have. And then that starts these sort of inter-army group rivalries around who exactly has to cover how much frontage, and that leads to all kinds of disputes. Really, also very rancorous disputes.
Hmm. Doesn't that eventually become like an issue of like one group is advancing quicker than the other?
Yep, definitely. Also, because as we said before, there are four panzer groups on the Eastern Front. They can't be everywhere, so they are prioritized in certain areas. Now, the starting positions are this: Army Group North has one panzer group, Army Group Center has two panzer groups, and Army Group South has one panzer group. But the panzer groups are not all equal sized. The two in the center are slightly bigger. They're about a third bigger than the ones in the north and in the south. And what does that mean? Exactly what you said. As you drive forward, you will see the central part of the Eastern Front drive very rapidly forward. Army Group North does a pretty good job of trying to keep pace, but that will drop off. But the real problem is in the south. That is because Army Group South is basically going to have to advance into the Ukraine. So their front is much wider to start with. And the majority of Soviet forces are also, in terms of their aggregate numbers, are a majority in the south, but also some of their best corps and things. They're in the south. So Army Group South really can't move forward. So what you start to see is the Eastern Front in the center and in the north is really pushing east without the same happening in the south. And that just means you get an increasingly long southern flank for Army Group Center. And the further they go east, the longer their southern flank becomes. And this is it's a separate issue, but when we were saying before, why don't they just keep driving east? And I was talking about that in terms of logistical problems, but there is also a military problem with that. Fine, even if you could keep going east, every kilometer you expand eastward is another kilometer that you're going to have to keep putting forces onto that southern flank to hold that area, because the Ukraine has a lot of Soviet forces in it. And what if they started going north? They would just drive straight into your logistics. So, yeah, that's without going into it, that is why there is in sort of, I guess, a second stage to this whole campaign, a concentration on Ukraine. There's something called the Battle of Kiev, which actually Guderian is central for that. He is, I guess, the key Panzer group commander in the Battle of Kiev, because because his army group has advanced so far. The opposite is also true. The Soviets have an exposed northern flank in the Ukraine, and Hitler is being pressured to keep attacking toward Moscow. A lot of the
Hitler is being pressured?
Yes, Hitler is being pressured. So
Oh.
I know. Sorry, I'm wondering if I'm doing this the best way for your listeners. They're probably thinking, "Gosh, this is a lot to take on." It is a big, complicated war. But yeah, let's just explore that in terms of like what's this strategic debate. Hitler, we all know, sits at the very top and is going to be the guy who will make the ultimate decision. But the German generals at this stage in the war still believe that they know best, right? And that they might be able to influence things. So the guy who's the most important man in the German army would be a guy named Franz Halder. He is the chief of the army general staff. So I said before there's an OKW, that's Hitler's generals. Then there's the high command of the army, that's the OKH. That's the guy there. Now, some people, if they know anything about the German army, might say, oh, no, that's not true, David. It's Brauchitsch. Brauchitsch is the head of the German army. But Brauchitsch is a very weak character. This is not a man who makes decisions. This is a man who was appointed because he's a weak character, because Hitler likes weak characters, because he can dominate them. But the guy who's running the army is Halder, and Halder has very strong views. He says, we've got to go straight to Moscow. So Brauchitsch is sort of on the same wavelength. They both kind of think this, but Halder's the real force there. Now, at the next level down, the commander of Army Group Center, he is the guy who commands the most German soldiers in the field. Army Group Center is by far the biggest army group. That's a guy named Fieder von Bock. He is absolutely convinced we need to go to Moscow. If you look at people like Guderian, he was absolutely convinced we should go to Moscow. So there's a lot of people who want to drive on Moscow. Hitler, on the other hand, has very little interest in Moscow. He is very interested in taking Leningrad in the very north, and he's very interested in taking the Ukraine, because he's always talking about economic resources. He's very interested in where the coal, where the copper, where the tin, and ultimately where the oil is, right? Although that's even further than the Ukraine, that's into the Transcaucasus. But Hitler's very focused on this. And basically, as all those tanks have now seized Smolensk, that's 600 kilometers into the Soviet Union, they are paused. They're paused because of all the things I said before. They've got to bring up more logistics, more fuel, more ammunition, got to wait for the infantry to catch up, got to bring up more artillery shells to begin that next big offensive. And that's what the German generals want. But Hitler's basically sitting there, and then that they want to go to Moscow. He doesn't want to do it. And there's a big discussion about this. And then ultimately Hitler will make his decision, and his decision is we're going into the Ukraine. It's very interesting how that works, though. In order to convince Hitler, the German generals know he doesn't listen to us, because generals, especially the desk generals, as Hitler calls them, the guys who just work in high commands, they aren't real generals. They're fake generals, right? They're the ones who parade around looking like generals, but for Hitler, he values the man at the front, and Guderian is the quintessential tank commander. Now, they know this, and they know that Guderian is a firebrand guy and a very strong personality. So they have the idea, let's send Guderian to Hitler's headquarters back in Poland. We'll send him back there to convince him of Moscow. And Guderian basically says, yeah, I'll go back there and I'll tell him what's what. Because, that's what I do too. And Guderian is that guy. He really, he really berates his commanding officers. He does a lot of that, right? Very strong personality. He goes back to Hitler's headquarters and he folds like a house of cards. In front of Hitler, he basically just gives it up straight away and says, yes, mein Führer, will do all of that. And he does. He comes straight back, and a lot of the generals feel like it's a massive betrayal. There's different people who've analyzed this. We don't really know because there's only 2 people in the room, so we only have Guderian's account. Basically, Guderian says, well, what was I supposed to do? He's the leader. He gave me an order. I told him I didn't think it was a good idea, but then I got my order. Other people have said, well, Guderian realized that his career was always going to be made by a guy like Hitler, and he thought he might be in contention for taking over the role of Brauchitsch. That's that guy I said who's the commander-in-chief of the German army, very weak character. And actually, by the end of 1941, he is fired. So people kind of could wonder, is Brauchitsch such a weak character he can't survive in that role? Guderian thought, maybe I will be his replacement. In any case, whatever actually happened there, Guderian comes back, and that will set off a whole new phase of the war in the East, where they won't drive toward Moscow, they drive into the Ukraine, and it's very successful. They basically encircle the Soviet armies that are trying to defend Kiev, and it's a very big victory. In fact, it's the biggest German victory of 1941. It's called the Battle of Kiev. They destroy about 4 Soviet armies. They capture about 650,000 Soviets. They probably kill, I don't know how many more than that, but probably another, up to 1 million men are wiped off the register. So we know 650,000 are captured, and many others are just either killed, wounded, but they're no longer in the Soviet order of battle. So it's a huge victory for the Germans, and it allows then a reconcentration for what they'll call Operation Typhoon, which is the advance on Moscow.
Could you get a little more into details about the role that Guderian played in the invasion of Ukraine? Like, what did his leadership style look like? What did his communication style look like? Like, how, like, what type of role did he play in that invasion specifically?
Yeah, Guderian, as I said, is incredibly aggressive, but he's perhaps, if I look at communications, he is a guy who understands uh, he understands the power of modern media, if I can put it that way. Like, not just in terms of military communications, how do you build your career? How do you become successful? Every Panzer group has a propaganda company attached to it, all right? That's very important because the thing people have to understand is in order to build your career in a rational world, but National Socialism isn't a rational world, you would say your military ability will be the determinant for your future success. No, that's not correct at all. Like, yeah, on some level you need to be successful, but hey, Guderian figures out, and look, I'm no fan of Guderian. I'm not a fan of any of them, right? They're all Nazis, but I'm not a fan of him as a military commander. But the one thing you have to say in his favor is he absolutely understands this idea of how do you sell yourself to be successful. And he recognizes that all of this propaganda company that is there, he utilizes them. I mean, there's other German generals you have to understand who are like, oh, get these cameras out of my face, out of the way. I am doing my things. Just stay right away, right? Guderian has them there. He's being photographed all the time. He's sending the photos back to Germany. Whenever there's the Wochenschau, that's the guys who take film and all this kind of stuff, he absolutely wants to be in there. And when you start to look at what's in the Wochenschau, he's disproportionately featured. The generals who don't care much for it obviously aren't there as much, and therefore Guderian looks like the guy who's winning all these battles. And that directly accounts for his success. I'll give you another example of how good at this he is. He has uh, a huge fan base. I know that sounds a bit crazy, right? No, no, I'm not talking neo-Nazis after the fact, after the war. Is a fan base in the war, right? There, German celebrities aren't footballers and singers. Yes, there are footballers and singers, but the kids who go to school, who read kids' magazines, are reading about military commanders, and they idolize them. So the kids are gathering signatures or autographs of the German generals. So they are writing them letters. And Guderian sits down on an evening and he will write back to these children. We know about it from his private letters where he says on a number of occasions, "Oh, my dear, I've got a ton of fan mail to answer. I got to, and he has even postcards printed up with his signature printed onto them, and he just sends those back. But he writes his name on them, maybe a small message, and then he just sends this stuff back. He's not the only one to do this. Others recognize how successful this was, and I've found dozens of German commanders. Keep in mind, there are 1,800 German generals in the Second World War, so there's a lot more than people realize. But there are dozens of them who have these kinds of postcards printed up. And they are exactly this, because it's not just Guderian, although Guderian is one of the absolute best you could get. He would be the Taylor Swift of their time, right? I need to get that autograph. But they're looking for anyone. They'll take corps commanders, divisional commanders, and it's remarkable how well informed some of these kids were. We have very little of it. But for example, one of the other Panzer commanders, Schmidt, in his personal papers, I found a letter from about a 10-year-old boy, and it's very, very interesting what that boy seems to know about him. He is writing to him, and what he's trying to do, the kid, is convince him to send me an autograph. So I will show you how much I know about your command. I know exactly what your rank is. There are actually 4 ranks of general, but he uses the correct one, right? I know that your corps captured Stalin's son. Stalin's son is captured on the Eastern Front about a month in, and that was by the 39th Panzer Corps. That's your corps. So congratulations. I can't remember I think he was a Colonel General at that point. Congratulations, Colonel General Schmidt, on your great success. He does all these things. Then he starts listing, I have currently got the autographs of Geerland, of this guy, of this guy, of this guy, basically trying to shame him into all these other people gave me him. So please. And then he writes the letters in great big letters, bitter, please, with exclamation points. And Schmidt obviously kept this letter. I dare say the young kid got his autograph. But if that's any indication, there's a real knowledge, and there's also, I think, bragging rights for kids. Look at the latest signature I've got. I've got this general. I guess, what does all that mean if you put it together? These guys aren't just leaders of men and extremely popular among their soldiers. They are extremely popular in the populace of Germany. And this is to no small extent, I think there's a very clear relationship between the most successful military figures and those who are most featured in a lot of this propaganda. They just understand that there's an association there. And of course, we all know selling success is about the perception of success. Whether it's actually success or not doesn't matter. It's the perception of success. And in that sense, I'd say Guderian was very much ahead of his time. Maybe as a final comment on that, for a man who made his career, when you think about it, in the Kaiser's Reich, he joins the army as a young lieutenant then. He's reasonably successful. He's successful in Weimar Germany. He's successful in Nazi Germany. And then he's successful after that in democratic Germany. How does a guy do that? These are not the same states. And in all of them, he's successful. And as soon as the war ends, he's suddenly not a Nazi. He knew nothing about war crimes. What do you mean there was terrible things going on? I never heard of any of this. And yet he's right there. He's doing this stuff. He's deeply implicated. In Christmas of 1944, I read in one of I can't remember where I read this, he was at Himmler's house for Christmas, at the private Christmas. And then 4 months later, he is the chief of the Army General Staff at this point, right? He has risen to the highest levels. He's on the inner circle of the inner circle. He's at Christmas with Himmler, and then he doesn't know anything. What do you mean there were war crimes? I've never heard of this. Yeah, the Nazis did a lot of that. And I think that is quintessentially Guderian. I don't mean that in a positive way. I mean, he's a despicable character. But yeah, you have to say he was very good at managing media.
Now, I think even though it is from a negative person, I think there's still so much to learn from that for modern day leaders, the importance of understanding that your image is everything. In 2025, that called it your personal brand. I mean, you just mentioned Napoleon too, and Napoleon was, of course, like an expert in this. He understood like the perception of the audience is the most important. Like if I'm successful in my military career right now, that's probably like second to important. Most important is that people think I'm successful, not that I am successful.
Yeah.
Um, with Guderian, you also mentioned that he was able to survive in three different, you call like before the Second World War, you got the Third Reich, and then you've got the Second Empire, Second Empire, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. How is that possible? Was that pure because he was so great at branding himself that way, or did he like cover himself in some form of way? Like, how is that possible that he survived that?
I mean, uh, Guderian, I think the first three, I mean, he's obviously a very young guy in the Kaiserreich, and there's no alternative, and he's not really given much authority there. He is able to continue after that to no small extent because, I mean, the German officer corps is extremely tight knit. It's its own culture. To give you an idea of how tight knit it is, you even in Guderian's time needed to get permission of your regiment to decide who you will marry. Like this is how closed the circles are. You don't just go and find yourself a wife. You need to get authority because she needs to belong to us. She will be on the inner sort of side of this, which says a lot about how closed those circles were. And of course, there's only 100,000 in the Reichswehr after the First World War. So even less officers, I think 4,000 officers. So it's a very small group, right? And these men are very, very conservative. So again, even that group, I think they look at someone like Hitler as a far better alternative than anyone who might be SPD or certainly communist or anything. So those shifts to me are easier to understand. The one that I think is most remarkable is how do you go from being a leading Nazi, nothing less than the most important military commander at the end of the war, when all kinds of things are happening. I mean, German soldiers are being, if they're not with their unit, they can very easily be hung, right? That's happening in Guderian's army. He is on the court of honor, which is basically a small select group of officers after the plot against Hitler that kicks these men out of the army so that they can then be tried by the people's court. So they're not going to be subject to some military court. We want to put them in the Nazi court where we can kill them. But we've got to get them out of the army first. So what we'll do is we'll get these elite officers, a very small group, but extremely trustworthy. Guderian can be one of them. And he does. He kicks these guys out of the army. And then, men like Herpen, one of the other men that I was talking about that I included in the book with his things. Herpen is one of these guys. They identify him. Guderian, yep, out of the army. And then he's hung with piano wire. So a brutal character with a lot of blood on his hands, not just in terms of Jews or partisan warfare or things like that would be enemies of the army. He does that to his own people, right? And then at the end of the war, how does he go from being that guy to being what is kind of a loved, if I could say it that way, and I don't know how strong you can be, but at that time, a lot of people in the Anglo-American world don't necessarily have a problem with a guy like Guderian. I mean, he is able to sell himself successfully as, oh, I was just an army officer following orders, right? I didn't, run death camps or anything. And there is a very real separation at the time between just soldiers and then Nazis, right? That's very successfully managed. And of course, who's managing that? The German generals themselves, because they're writing the memoirs. I mean, Hitler's dead. Himmler's dead. Goering's, well, he dies shortly thereafter, right? He commits suicide in Nuremberg. But those guys, they're the Nazis. And then all these other guys say, well, I'm anything but, I didn't know, I had no idea. And the corrective, the thing that would have told everybody, no, these guys are deeply complicit, are all those German military files. But that takes there's vast numbers of them. And initially, they're not available to historians or to journalists, right? They're just great crates of information that's all shipped back to the United States. And we don't really get access to it until the 1960s, right? So there's a good 20-year period there where Guderian can say whatever he wants. And frankly, if you want to know what was happening on the inside of the German command, you got to read these memoirs. And people did. And, Guderian's not the only one. That memoir is very readable. It's a good little book. I mean, I have to say, I've read quite a lot of these German general memoirs. Some of them are terrible, like really boring books. They're just not well written, and they're very filled with like almost like military, like we did this, then we did this, then we did this. It doesn't make for a great read. Guderian's a much better writer. Let's just put it that way. People like Munstein, Erich von Munstein, he's also very good at this. He writes a good memoir. So they aren't just books like instruction manuals. They're kind of good reads, if I can put it that way, if you're interested in the Second World War. But it does mean that image is perverted from a very early point.
Okay, so because the general, just to like summarize it, so basically what happened, and to understand it, is that the generals were able to separate themselves from the Nazis and the common soldier, basically, and he was able to do the same thing, I guess. But like, my question is, and I think I can't imagine like any of the Americans didn't have this question. Like, if you're on top of the top, how blind can you be?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two answers to that. One is to say, yeah, I think the Americans really were quite blind, but were they blind? This is the question. Or were they not looking at a new situation in Europe where there are 12 million men in the Red Army? That Red Army is right in the middle of Europe, and these guys are the experts at fighting the Soviets. They have been fighting them for 4 years. They know a lot about this. They are all very anti-Soviet. They are suddenly very pro-Western, and they talk about, Western civilization and Western culture. Oh, come on. Those are the guys who were just destroying Western culture and civilization by bombing, destroying, killing. I mean, Nazism as an idea abrogates that early modern Enlightenment, right? They're not interested in law. They're not interested in morality. They're not interested in religion. They they decide for themselves. So they're not Western civilization. And yet that language shift, but it seems to Americans, oh yeah, these are good cultured Germans. Germans, they're the people of Beethoven. They're very good. And of course, this is how they sold themselves. They're very proper and, well presented and very formal in the way they speak. I think it swept the Americans and the British and all the rest of it off their feet in a way. Like that they are very convinced, they want to believe, they see the Soviet threat. That is not to say, if you're very well read on Nuremberg, there is the famous Nuremberg trials, but there are people looking at these files already at this time and seeing time and again the German army are implicated, right? And so they then begin more trials. There is something called the High Command trial, which takes place in, I think, 48. And this is German generals now, only German generals being put on trial at Nuremberg for crimes that they have committed. But what's interesting as a subtext is there are, by this point, large numbers of people who feel, even in the Anglo-American world, these German generals' trials, this is now just victor's justice. I mean, they've gone past the Nazi leadership now. Now they're just rounding up German generals. It's not right. They shouldn't be doing that, right? And of course, all these German generals are writing to newspapers just about wherever they can and getting their defense counsels to say, I was just there were orders. I mean, what was I supposed to do? And people haven't yet connected. People think that the murder is things like Gestapo or death camps, which is clearly not the German generals. What people haven't yet understood, it takes decades before people understand that the ubiquitous nature of German criminality is the fact that millions of Soviets will starve to death because they have no food. And millions of Soviets will die because they're just exposed to disease. And millions of Soviets die because, the basic ability to preserve life, like I need to have my chickens and I need to have my cow because that's how I live. Oh, but when the German soldiers go through, they take all of that because they're going to live off the land, right? So who's recording their deaths? No one stood there with a gun and shot them, but they die. And if you're thinking about how many actually die, we get about 14 million, 14.6 million is the highest estimate of Red Army deaths in the Second World War. And if you tally up the full number of Soviets who die, it's 28 million. So that means we are, yes, the Holocaust is horrific and 6 million died. There's no question the death camps are doing terrible carnage, and this is industrialized killing. But there's more deaths in the East for innocent civilians, and they're not being killed. Yes, some of them are, as they're killed because they're suspected partisans, and someone goes into the village and shoots 100 people. But a lot of them probably just die because the ability to survive has been taken away by the German army, not the German SS. There's 3 million men in the East, right? They're German soldiers. How many are in the Einsatzgruppen? That's the guys, the SS guys running around shooting people. There are 4,000 in that. So your chances of running into one of these SS guys is a lot less than just meeting the German army. And the German army aren't walking around shooting everybody. It's what I call secondary criminality. So if they're stealing chickens, right? What are you going to survive on? This is a poor part of the world. What are you going to do over the winter? That's a real problem. If they're coming in and stealing your grain, right? And keep in mind, as those German units go through your village, one of them goes through on one day, the next day another group come through and they want stuff. Yeah, but I just gave stuff. Yeah, I don't care. We are hungry too. And then the third one comes through, and the fourth one comes through, and the fifth one comes through, and these guys get progressively more angry. Oh, you always tell me you don't have anything. I don't have anything, I don't have anything. And they know if you start digging in their barns or you start looking at their mud hut walls, they've got these little cabinets and things there, you find stuff. And it just goes to show these people lie to you, right? They all lie. They all say they got nothing, and then they do, right? But of course, this is what they're keeping to get through the winter. Now, the next thing that happens is it starts to get really cold in the Soviet Union, and the Germans don't have enough winter uniforms. But if you go to those little villages, they've got some wonderful winter clothes in there and big felt boots and stuff like this. So you just go in there and you take it. So what did, again, these guys do? How do you get through the winter when your clothing's gone? You still got to go out and chop wood. You still got to go to market and sell stuff maybe, especially if you haven't got anything. And then ultimately when it gets really cold and the German soldiers don't have anywhere to stay, they can't sleep outside in their tents, they're going to go into the houses and kick the people out. So how many people die from this? In other words, what I'm trying to make the case is Guderian and these kinds of men are responsible because in their area of occupation, there's no orders that say, hey, don't treat the civilian population terribly. No, the civilian population are there to serve the German army. And if they're suspected of criminality, they might even get shot, of associating with partisans or in any way opposing us. But other than that, they're just a resource for us to use.
I think there's something to say for if you are doing something knowing that that person might die eventually as a cause. So, for instance, sending them out the house or stealing their food, knowing they don't have anything else. I do think there's something to say for that, that is a type of murder. And it does kind of sadden me that we do kind of view this type of history as if the life of the Soviets was maybe worth less in some sort of sense. Because no one ever talks about the 28 million that you just mentioned. The focus is normally on the others.
Well, certainly in military history, this is one of the divides. Military historians have often been interested in operations and battles and things. It's certainly when I was growing up, there was this huge divide in the literature. People would write about that stuff. And then what Germans call the Vernichtungskrieg, this war of annihilation, is a whole separate literature that actually Germans do a lot of, right? Because they don't engage with military history. They don't really study battles and campaigns. That's kind of taboo, especially for academics. I'm not saying there's not German histories of that stuff, but they tend to be really poor, right? Because the people left to do it are often non-academics. In some cases, they're kind of right-wing crazies. They're published by really questionable publishing houses that have just published Hitler's, secret, book and all this kind of stuff. They really can be dodgy publishers. So there's a big divide. And I think in the last 20, 30 years, that divide has changed. There's now histories that are putting the two together, that are recognizing the war in the East is both a conventional war of armies and it's at the same time a war of annihilation. It's kind of two things. The Germans are killing two different groups of people. There's the conventionals, there's the Red Army, and then there's the Soviets. But I think you're still correct. I do wonder, and you're probably a better test case than I am on this. Like, what do average people know? It's just harder for me to judge that, having spent too much time with historians and whatever else. But yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of people, and I know when I first started studying this, I was shocked at those numbers too. I was just shocked. Hang on, if you're telling me that there's 28 million, is that right? Soviets who die, how many of the British died? Because that's what we'd studied in Australia, British, and it turns out the number is 400,000. Now, that's not to diminish. 400,000 is a huge number. But if you're telling me for what we imagine when we see Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin sitting there, and one loses 400,000, the Americans, oh, I'm doing this off the top of my head, I think it's about 350,000 for the Americans. And then there's the Soviets with 28 million. And the other big missing link here are the Chinese. They lose 20 million.
Huh?
Because the war with the Japanese begins in 1937, so it's a longer war, but it's also a terrible, terrible war. What the Japanese do there, it's a similar thing. Like, they even try and drop smallpox on them at one point because they want to kill as many as possible. They destroy dams and kill 1 million people at one point. I can't remember how much, 800,000 or something. And they blow up a dam, and it just floods one of the Chinese planes and kills, just hundreds of thousands. I mean, these are horrific wars, right? But when you put it in those terms and you say, well, how many people died and where did they die? That is disproportionate to our classic understanding of where the big battles took place, right? But I think that the thing I would just add to that, just to make that point really clear, is the wars or the battles that are being fought are highly technical, and therefore the loss of life is disproportionate to the importance. In other words, if you look at, I don't know, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a really big naval encounter in the Pacific, yeah, I don't know off the top of my head how many people die in that battle, probably 10,000 or something like that. A lot of them are mostly Japanese, right? So you could say only 10,000 die there. Yeah, but a large number of highly sophisticated tonnage goes down. It's critical for the Japanese. That matters greatly. And I don't want to say 10,000 civilians somewhere on the Eastern Front or somewhere in occupied Soviet Union don't matter. Of course they do as humans, but to the outcome of the war, less so. That's why the military histories keep talking about all that other stuff. And in some ways, I think you could say that there's a history of the Second World War from a human perspective that's kind of underrepresented.
Yeah. Because from those 28 million, do we have any idea how many of them were like civilians instead of Red Army soldiers?
Yep. So that's what I was trying to say before. I probably did it with too much information. As I recall, so there's all kinds of disputes about how many Red Army soldiers were killed. That's a debate that basically ranges between about 9 million and 14.6, right? But I tend to favor a higher level, although I'm not a Soviet historian, so I'll leave it. But I've read a couple of these books, and I tend to think that the figures, it makes a lot more sense to go for the higher ones. I won't go into it. And pretty much everything after that is civilian.
So 10 to 12 million.
Yeah, so yeah, about 13 million,
Wow.
which is huge, right?
I mean, yeah, because you just asked like what's as like the average person who like knows about just the average from World War II, like what I noticed from my friends and like people my age. We mostly focus on the 6 million, obviously. That's the biggest focus, but we don't really think about the 13 million that passed. I mean, we'd probably think it wasn't even that big of a deal over there. Like I mean, Stalin is seen as quite a big character, a strong character. So I think the average person doesn't necessarily view World War II, especially like the Eastern Front, in such a bad that it wasn't such a bad situation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't mind saying, and I sort of alluded to it before, when I first started studying, I did a course at university in my first year, and I had the same impression. I remember even thinking, how can these numbers be right? And the reason I thought these numbers can't be right is because I thought I was sitting there as someone who knew something about World War II, because I paid attention at school, and I don't know if I'd read books much. I'd read a bit on articles, magazines, stuff like that. But I just couldn't reconcile this Eastern Front is the Second World War, and what's happening anywhere else is very, very small. So for us in the Anglo-American world, North Africa, Rommel, he's such an important guy. Rommel. Rommel is a corps commander. That doesn't mean much to anyone perhaps listening, unless you're in the military. But to give you an idea, there are 44 corps on the Eastern Front. There is one in North Africa. So it's amazing to me, and I did this because I teach at a military academy. I said, who's this? And I put a picture of Rommel up. I had almost every hand up. They all knew who Rommel was, right? And then I said, right, he's a corps commander. There are 44 corps commanders on the Eastern Front. in 1941 when they invade, and actually there'd be a couple of hundred over the whole time of the war, right? Because they constantly change. Can anyone name any other? Not surprisingly, no one could name a single other corps commander other than the one who fought the Anglo-Americans, including, of course, the Australians, in North Africa. But again, that speaks to your point, right? We have a very Anglo-American view of the Second World War.
But there's something to say for that too. Like, the victor always writes the history, right? And what we just talked about, with Guderian, like the power of like marketing and knowing how to create the narrative and create the story. That's such a powerful tool, like storytelling in itself. And there's something to say for that. Maybe the Soviets weren't really that good at the storytelling, especially like on a broad level, on like international basis. And also, I think that also has to do with that the Soviets eventually fell. Maybe I'm not an historian, but that the American empire is still the biggest empire at this very moment. So they've always been able to create the narrative, create the story, and
I think
focus the story on
you're
their own heroes.
You're absolutely right, but keep in mind that Cold War makes a big division in the world, and suddenly the Anglo-Americans, which is the world we grew up in, or our parents and grandparents grew up in, is oh, look at us and what we did. And of course, let's not talk too much about those Soviets because they're now kind of the bad guys. And I'm pretty sure Russians, they're hearing a lot about what they call the Great Patriotic War, and, we could say, well, yes, they certainly also, suffered huge losses. But did they actually talk about some of the amazing American feats in the Pacific and all that kind of stuff? Probably a lot less, right? I think that ownership of history, because you're right, history is real power in terms of shaping narratives and getting populations mobilized. Yeah, that's, I think, a really important point. But I think, you know, I think that's more of a problem for us in the West because we pride ourselves. I think this was my dilemma at age 19 when I was first encountering this. I had this idea that I'm not lied to. I live in the West. We have free media. I I wasn't given the propaganda view of history. I was given the honest view. And I was sitting there reading this stuff. Or I heard it in my first of my lectures, and then I went away and I was definitely on that stage reading for myself. Partly because I was fascinated, partly because I didn't know what was on the next page. And this suddenly felt like I I have only been given half of this book. And it even took a year or two before I started to realize, as I was saying before, the whole Chinese dimension. I'd never even thought of it. I'd always thought, yeah, we fought the Japanese. We fought the Japanese. We Australians then I started to realize, oh God, the Chinese. That was where the Japanese were mostly concerned until 1941. In fact, as my lecturer famously once said, not to take us off topic, but I'll never forget it, she said, don't think of Pearl Harbor as Japan's entry into the war. Think of Pearl Harbor as Japan's first desperate move in a war that they've been fighting since 1937 and a war that they're starting to worry they're going to lose because the Americans are now limiting oil access and all of this, things that a modern army needs. And they've got a huge campaign and a huge war with 1 million men in China fighting against the Chinese. They can't lose. And the Americans see that and basically say, let's cut the oil. And so,
So maybe Americans were the ones who started the war with the Japanese by
oh,
cutting off the oil.
well, let's be quite clear. Roosevelt has no sympathy for the Japanese, and he's correct not to. These are a very imperialist Japanese force that's expanding deep into China. He does not want to abandon his Chinese ally. He wants to make it as difficult as he possibly can. There's also American hubris there. They don't see that if we do this, they think they can do it with a degree of impunity, right? Because the Japanese wouldn't attack us, would they? I mean, they wouldn't dare do that. Of course, oh God, they will. I don't think the Americans were fully cognizant of how dangerous the Japanese and how far they would go to preserve their position in China. I mean, I'm not suggesting the Americans had no sense of threat, but the idea that it would be such a bold attack to sink their entire Pacific fleet, or that is at least the plan. They don't really achieve it, but that does catch the Americans off guard.
To get back to like the letters for a second, like
Mm.
Guderian, eventually in like the Eastern Front, do you see any letters of him kinda losing the spirit, maybe even losing hope that they'll even win this massive campaign.
Yes, that is very, very true. It's one of the things that makes the letters so interesting as a source. Because again, I'm that guy who spent many years writing these books, and I would have said to you, I have a sense of who these guys are. But of course, the only sense I can develop is through military files. And in a military file, they're not going to write, oh, I'm feeling depressed today. Gosh, this war's been going on for months. I'd really like to go home. But private letters are different. And that is, you definitely see this for Guderian. In fact, his mental state, I would say, declines appreciably. And it's not just through his letters that you can chart it. There are some other sources of other people that are private sources at the time, so diaries and things, of people who come into contact with Guderian and share private time with him and notice the same thing. I mean, one of them even says, oh, I engaged with Guderian. I went there because I wanted the powerful big Panzer general to sort of buck me up, because it was in December of 1941, so it's cold. The war's been going on for many months. Barbarossa has not been successful. And he just writes in his diary, I didn't discover the great Panzer general. I encountered, the German term is a Gummilöwe, a rubber lion. And that fits very much with the letters. The letters become more and more depressive as the year goes on. Margrethe, that's Guderian's wife, we have some of her letters, and she's remarking on it too. So she's definitely doing her best to try and keep him motivated. But I'm not critical of Guderian in that way. I think if you're on the Eastern Front for months, you're seeing the destruction of your own units. He goes, of course, to hospitals and gives out medals. These men are in terrible conditions. They're frostbitten, they've got arms missing, they're, horrendous. The idea that you wouldn't be impacted by that's very human. And Guderian, one thing you can say about these letters, if you took a German, you could take a German. If you took a German general today or an American general today, and you put them in a position, whatever the last American commander in Afghanistan was, I would not be convinced if you showed me his letters that he did not know that those letters were one day going to be in the public domain. He would be writing them with that in mind. So they're not really private letters in that way, because he just knows how that modern world works. What's different with Guderian and those guys is these are private letters. He doesn't really think that you and I are sitting here discussing them, or that I might have written a book and quoted huge parts of them. In fact, I've now published them, right? So I don't think he had any sense of that. And therefore he wasn't self-censoring in the way that his wife as well, in the way that we would probably expect someone more modern. For all those reasons that you said, people are very, what did you call it? Image conscious, brand, that their own personal brand. Maybe you don't want to write something in your published letters that don't reflect the brand you are trying to project. And back then, there was no history of German generals' private letters from the 19th century. What? No one publishes that. That's private. But that's very different today.
Yeah, so there were letters from generals from the First World War, private letters
That's a good
back then
question.
published.
I don't know. There might have been. I think what I'm trying to say is that in the mind of the general at the time, that seemed inconceivable. That there wasn't a tradition of that, and I just don't know of any Napoleonic generals or someone who all his private letters were published in the 19th century that could have given them the idea that this is possible, because that had not been part of the tradition. Private letters to their wives were private letters to their wives, and they would have known that their orders would perhaps be reproduced in books and things, but this is different. This was very different. So while there could be First World War generals' letters in the public domain now, I don't know of any that were published in that interwar period to give them a sense that this is where the world would go. I mean, we can all agree that that's really interesting. As soon as I found out that these letters were there, I wanted to see them.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely better reading letters knowing that no one will ever read them, because then you know that the person was actually speaking the truth, or at
Mm.
least their truth. It's the same with I've recently been reading Meditations from Marcus Aurelius again,
Mm.
and I was reading it. I was just thinking this guy 2,000 years ago, he had no clue that we'd be reading this right now. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have been as open in these letters as he actually is right now. So it's fascinating when people do that. Um, with Guderian, do we eventually see like after the war a sense of what feeling regret or feeling some type of remorse towards maybe the Soviets or maybe even remorse towards the Nazi soldiers as he like kind of maybe failed strategically?
Uh, no, that is one thing about Guderian. He is very much a kind of national socialist type general. He doesn't look at peoples in the East and thinks, "Oh God, we've done terrible things." At least there's nothing in his letters to suggest any of that. But even if we look at post-war, um, he was virulently anti-Soviet, and of course that was also perfectly acceptable in the early parts of the post-war era because the Cold War is very intense and everyone's worried that the Soviets are going to take over the rest of Europe. So being anti-Soviet is normal, I would say. Um, he doesn't really have that. He's also a guy who is incredibly self-sure. So is he reflective on any of the problems that he has? If you look at his memoir or uh, 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 any of the conversations that are recounted, no. If anything, he's more indignant than ever that he was correct. And what he basically does is he will blame uh, the rest of the command for not supporting him enough to achieve his objectives. And what's interesting there is you will see the same thing as I was saying right at the beginning, replicated by the other Panzer generals. They are, if you imagine this is a very wide front and there's not enough soldiers, there's not enough vehicles, there's not enough logistics coming up to the front. So everyone wants more of what is not enough. And therefore, everyone always complains. And what a lot of the German generals can never really understand is they always think, in my sector, I'm the poor cousin. I am the one who is denied everything. And the people in other parts have a lot more than me. They think this. But it's actually not true, right? There's no part of the Eastern Front where they have vast amounts and enough artillery. Everyone's fighting a poor man's war. But they always assume that people left and right have more. I think the way to think of it is, I used to think of it as, oh, there's a German army and they allocate their supplies evenly and there's a process for it and that's just how it works. But I think of it today very differently. I think of it as almost like medieval lords with their filedoms, each running their own war, incredibly suspicious of the other lords, who they think are getting more than them, everyone competing for favor of the king, which is Hitler, and distrustful, manipulative. To give you an idea of how bad it gets, at one point, Guderian informs his subordinates. He says, look, go into this area. This is after the Battle of Kiev has taken place. Keep in mind, there's these 4 smashed Soviet armies, and there's a lot of vehicles and artillery and real things that you can use to supplement your own supplies, right? So he says, drive down there and take anything you can find. And one of these commanding officers, I can't remember the exact dialogue, so I'm doing this. This is more than 10 years ago I wrote this book, but this guy says that's the area of I think it's the Second Army. If we go down there, that's in their area. And Guderian basically says, yes, I know. You go in there and you take anything. And if they try and stop you, you shoot at them. In other words, that's pretty extreme stuff, right? And apparently there is an engagement when they're down there. I mean, I don't know if they're killing any other German soldiers. Maybe they're just shooting in the air. But it goes to show how headstrong he is and how I don't care for my fellow commander. I care for me. And it's all about us. And you might say, yeah, that's Guderian. I might have said, yeah, that's Guderian 15 years ago. Having seen these letters, they're all like this. They're all they're scathing of other generals. They don't like them. Herpener has a similar thing. He does not like, does not like, does not like. And then at one point, one of the generals he doesn't like, which is Reinhardt, and then they find themselves some months later arguing for the same thing, and suddenly they're best friends. It's so power politics, right? Yeah.
Do you think Hitler also set it up in a way that he wanted these people to compete? Because if you create like maybe only one unit, then there's just one unit doing it. But if you create like 4 units, you basically have like 4 units competing with each other to be the best. It's kind of like China um, what China sometimes does is like if they want to take over like an industry, they'll create like five companies in that industry, and they let those five companies just compete with each other, because the power of competition is so strong. Like it really
Mm.
gets the best out of us.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's truth in that for sure. And I think Hitler's he likes the ambiguity in the command, and he likes the fact that a lot of the people in the inner circle, they are fighting each other. Um, but they look to him as the kingmaker, right? And in a sense, if they're all doing that, then I guess is a less of a challenge to him. Yeah.
Yeah, because if it's only one, then one can like form and eventually like maybe even go against them. But if they're all to fight it, it does give him more stability, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's
Hitler.
definitely true of the German generals, and it's definitely true of his inner circle. I mean, a lot of the people who are in his inner circle are such sycophants. I mean, they're incapable of criticizing, right? I mean, Goebbels, we have phenomenal Goebbels diaries. We have, I think we have 15 volumes between 1941 and 1945. So we have that man just prolific. So you have a real insight into the man. And at times you can see he's definitely been critical, but he almost can't bring himself ever to actually be critical. He's just, even when he knows Hitler's wrong, he might have the most veiled of criticisms, and then he'll have to write a whole paragraph or two saying how great he is. Um, and of course, the problem in any good command sort of system is if you get to that point where nobody can criticize or nobody can say the wrong thing, uh, ultimately your ability to have a realistic understanding of yourself or of the world, because everyone's telling you what you want to hear and there isn't any real free flow of information and you're closed to that, it's ultimately self-defeating, which is very, very much Nazi Germany.
Mm. Yeah. Do you think like a big part of the fall of the Nazi regime is that they weren't able to give each other feedback without getting killed?
Well, certainly in the military space, that becomes a huge problem. I mean, you have some people who are strong personalities, you can say that they're strong personalities, and who on occasion even do speak their minds to Hitler. Um, a- a- uh, but the overwhelming majority are in the positions they're in because they're the right kind of personalities. They will tell Hitler what he wants to hear, and it becomes a sort of Hitler doesn't even have to do it anymore. For example, when you fly to see Hitler, you will often be intercepted by one of these generals before you ever make it into the room, and they'll give you very strict instructions about what you are not to say. Or what you are to talk about, or he's having a very bad day today, so do not mention blah, blah, and blah. And these will usually be the things that the general has come specifically to talk about. And then they find themselves sort of cut off at the knees before they even get in there. I mean, keep in mind, these men are also very powerful, right? They're field marshals. I mean, Keitel, who's the guy who often does this thing, he's a field marshal. He's the commander in chief of the Wehrmacht. He's the most important, in a sense, military commander. And if he tells you that you're not to discuss something, takes a particularly bold person to walk straight on in there and do it anyway. And I mean, some do, but you know, that already perverts the information that Hitler gets. And of course, Hitler doesn't deal well with that information. If he gets upset enough, the screaming tirades that he'll go into. I've only ever been yelled at once or twice in my adult years, but I didn't enjoy it either time. So
Yeah, no, I do see like companies and countries kind of like a quite similar thing. And I think if the leader doesn't get the right information, if your employees or if your soldiers then are scared to give you the real information because they feel like you're gonna give them a bad reaction, then you kind of close off this quick feedback loop. And if you have no feedback loop, then how are you ever gonna make decisions? Correct decisions. You're gonna make decisions based on false information or non-existent information. Like it's impossible
100%.
to run a sufficient company or country that way. Yeah.
I like what you say there because I think people can often think, that's a subset. This is the Nazi mindset. This is Hitler. No, I think you're right. I think it can be a company. I think it's much more common. I work at a university. I have people who say, I don't want to read any, and I will not read any student feedback. They don't know anything about my area. Sorry, I don't take feedback from them. And I have to sit there and say to them, no, you do take feedback because you're a professional and professionals get feedback. I mean, we're not teaching those students for ourselves. I'm not the only one in that room. And if it's too high or too low or whatever, then that's a problem for them. We're only doing it for them. So, yeah, we listen to what they say. Beyond the fact that we're a university and we're accredited, and that means accreditation means we get feedback and we deal with that feedback. The idea that we ignore it. But it's funny how people, reasonable people will quickly go into a mindset, or otherwise reasonable people, where they start justifying, to me, ridiculous things that make sense to them. I mean, why are they doing it? Because I don't have to then be subject to any criticism, because I don't have to read anything negative about myself. So I won't say that's the reason. I'll make it something else. I'll say, oh, they're just 18-year-olds. What do they know? I'm a serious professional. I don't take feedback from 18-year-olds. And yeah, I think you are going to be a better educator and a better historian, and frankly, just a better person, no matter what you do, if you are taking feedback all the time. That does not mean that the 18-year-olds always say the right thing. I think in my last lot of feedback, I got told, David, your lectures should be outside. And I thought, that is a great piece of feedback. I would love to do outdoor lectures. It'll never in a million years happen. We have no projectors. I don't know where everyone's going to sit on the grass while I yell out things for for an hour. But I get it. That's what some people think. Can't we just go outside?
I mean, I wish I got to go outside. I definitely would have paid more attention, I believe.
I was going to say, if I'd done outdoor education, he'd be right. Let's go on a nature walk. But history, it's probably going to happen inside.
Yeah. No, I think like what you said is definitely true. And I think like the best leaders, like the leaders we really look up to and the leaders who have got a really good track record, they're always open to feedback and open to criticism and open to information that they might not want to hear. And I think like a big thing to like give that impression towards the people under you is by having emotional control. I think
Mm.
that's probably the biggest thing. Like, it's quite fascinating. I just finished this biography on John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil. Morally, maybe not the correct person always. um, but the thing you could say about him is that the reason he was able to build maybe the first $1 trillion company ever was because he never got angry. So his assistant could give him the worst information and he just digested and then just make up a plan and then work with it. And I think if Hitler did the same thing, who knows, maybe we might be talking German right now. Who
Yeah,
knows?
no, I definitely, that's so relatable as well, right? I mean, I probably, anyone I'm about to hit 50, I've had enough bosses in my time I've had the ones who have used sharp tones, and I have, had the opposite as well. My current boss is wonderful, right? But you realize how different you are as a person, and how you respond. I will do almost anything my boss asks me, or forget the fact that he's my boss. Anyone I like, I will do a lot for. But if I don't have that level of respect, I'll do what's in the contract. I will do exactly what I have to and nothing more. And that is as a motivating factor. I'll never forget it. A student said it to me once. He said to me, he gave me his paper and then he apologized. And I said, "Why do you apologize?" And he goes, "Because it's shit. It's a crap paper, David." And I said, "You know what? That's a good sign, though, that you care enough about what you make me read, because I'm pretty sure you don't apologize to every other person you give bad papers to. Is 100% not. But I don't want you to think that I just blew your class off." And I said, "You don't want me to think that, but you just told me you did basically blow my class off and do it at last minute." "I know, but I'm sorry." I said, all right. It's all right. You can be sorry. But I do think that's true. I still think more students or whoever will be motivated, not just because of whatever power you have, but their relationship to you. And it's such a force multiplier. It's hard to quantify. You'll never be able to quantify it. But is it there? Yes. Does it do a lot? I mean, I've seen it myself. I will really do things for people if I respect them above and beyond. But yeah, the opposite is also true.